Good afternoon, class. Welcome to my lecture on civil rights. I think after this, I'll probably have one more lecture for you guys of getting into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And pretty much what we're going to be working on after that is from here on out is your research papers. But for today, let's talk about civil rights. Now, the last lecture I gave was in the 60s, and we talked about Vietnam, Cuban Missile Crisis, the anti-war movement, and all that is coupled at the same time as civil rights. All this is happening at the exact same time. So, the 60s, very tumultuous period in American history on into the early 70s. So, when we look at like discrimination, segregation, racism, KKK, violence toward minority. The roots of that go way back. And when I'm talking about way back, we can look at like the early days when we have like Bacon's Rebellion, and slaves were set against slave. We're working together, so they decided to break up the slaves by treating indentured servants, which are white slaves, a little better than African American slaves. But let's move a little more forward to kind of like the way a certain type of history was presented in the United States that helped to shape the American psyche, like the American sense of itself and the sense of its history. And that we can trace that back to the end of the Civil War. Now, there's that famous phrase that says that the victors write the history. But the Civil War is unique in the fact that that didn't happen. It wasn't the victors that wrote the history. It was the losers. It was the Confederacy. And they spawned this lost cause theory. And this lost cause theory was basically rewriting the history of the Civil War. Um, and, and in a way, erasing the negativity, especially erasing slavery, and looking at this as like, the gallant South, invaded by the horrible North, and the only reason we won is better technology, better this, but we were the more honorable people just defending our land. And it starts to create this whole narrative in which we, look at the South, not the South in general, but the Confederacy itself as something other than what it really was. And it created this narrative in the United States of the Civil War just being about it was just like differences of culture, but the sense is what we don't go deeper than that. Like, what about the cultures were different? And when it comes down to is the South's economy was built on slavery. And so, being such a negative thing, they used it to, they had to rewrite that as something not so negative. So, what this lost cause theory brings forth is different, a very different version of the truth of the history of the South. So, they started to talk about how the slaves were happy, they were well taken care of, they loved their masters. And so, like, slavery was not that bad. We weren't bad people. The Confederacy was not a bad thing. And it wasn't about slavery because the slaves were happy. And in a sense, giving rise this idea of, these concepts of what, like looking at African Americans of what they were, it started to, create this image that they were childlike, that they needed to be taken care of, that they were lazy. And, therefore, if you can say all these things, then you can justify the fact that, oh, you know what, they're not as evolved as us. That's why we had to take care of them. Like, creating the image of slavery like a good thing, like a paternalistic thing, when it really wasn't. And they when they talk about like the war wasn't about slavery, it was just about two competing different ideals. Which it only takes a few minutes to look up the secession documents, and that each and every one of them say they seceded, to maintain and preserve slavery and white supremacy. It doesn't even take a lot to look up. But what happens is after the Civil War, This idea of this lost cause image, this idea of talking, presenting the history this way, is taken up by the daughters of the Confederacy, and they literally um, lobbied all the states, their textbooks, to have this type of narrative, this type of story. They were heavily involved in the education of the children of the U.S., and they managed to get this story told throughout, in textbooks and in schools. So after so many generations, that's all people just genuinely believe. And that's and that it was, the war wasn't about anything other than differences of opinions. It was an honorable war. The South was honorable. They were only defending their homes, and slavery wasn't bad. It was a paternalistic thing. We were taking care of them. We were feeding them. They were happy to work with us, and so forth. So you get this idea, first of all, that in the that the war wasn't about slavery, that slaves, African Americans, were inferior to white people and had to be taken care of, and therefore, they really didn't, um, they didn't deserve all the rights and privileges that supposedly they got with the Civil War, after the war, with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. So this is the narrative that is, told to the whole nation. Although you say, we can sit there and say, the South promoted it more, but no, this is in everyone's textbooks. And so as we look at, understanding the civil rights movement, you have to understand this is the kind of narrative they're fighting. Another issue that they had at the time was in 1896, there was a suit, Plessy versus Ferguson. And the end result of that ruling was basically that, segregation was okay as long as both sides had the same thing. So they, separate but equal. You both have schools, you both have textbooks. Then, that is legal, and this kind of legalized and justified segregation in the South and the North. And it also did, gave birth to all these Jim Crow laws, these, this like a poll tax to prevent people who couldn't afford to vote, pay to vote, different tests that were placed in the as barriers to keep African Americans from voting. And so, and then of course, just different laws about, like, like sundown laws, where you can't be on the streets after sundown because Lord knows you might be up to no good. And this is like, pervasively throughout the South. These laws these laws are created, put on the books, and they're legal because they look at them as, just extensions of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, on a side note, we talk about civil rights, and we talk about these kind of laws, segregating and really regulating the behavior of African Americans. You had similar things throughout the Southwest. We referred to them as Juan Crow laws, but the exact same things were applied to, Latinos, Mexican Americans in the Southwest. Now, we look at, the origins of the civil rights movement as the way as we see it, and as it's and as it evolved over time. I mean, from the beginnings, there are always people attempting to speak out, but when we can really see like a more organized, and also not just organized but intellectual end of it, was, when we're looking at the Harlem Renaissance, we're looking at the poetry of Langston Hughes, we're looking at, people like W. Du Bois and other people, talking and, writing and lecturing about, the evils of all this. And so what they're, and we look at what W. Du Bois was doing, and he was putting forth just this notion that we should be already equal. Like, there should nothing, be barriers in our way. Ever since the Civil War is over, that question's been answered in his mind. And W.B. Du Bois was a very well-educated man, wrote a book about the souls of Black people, advocating for what it was like to be Black in America. So, and this, and the civil rights movement, kind of starts to organize really well up into the movement that we see today after World War II. And that's because, many people who served in the war now felt like, I did my time, I bled for this country, and we died for this country. We need to get, what they refer to as first class citizenship. There should be no doubt in it. And President Truman, to his credit, believed that we need to start to end this segregation. We need to start bringing people together. So him being commander in chief and knowing that even if you hate an order, you have to follow it in the military, he begins desegregation in the military by desegregating the armed forces. So that was a step toward, you know, desegregation, step toward, bringing down these barriers. One other big barrier, of course, baseball. Jackie Robinson gets signed and, breaks the color line in baseball. And what's really interesting about Jackie Robinson is, up until this point, if you were African American, you played the Negro Leagues. And the Negro Leagues had some of the best players. So that's where they look to, find someone to, break the color line. Now, in the history of baseball, and especially the Negro Leagues, the greatest player wasn't Jackie Robinson, it was a man named Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige holds all these records in baseball. But Satchel Paige didn't have the temperament they were looking for. They needed someone who, because he's going to break the color line, whoever this person's going to be, and Lord knows he's going to get things thrown at them. People are going to yell at him, maybe even attack him, and they need someone who can just sit there and take it, not really fight back. And Satchel Paige had a temper, so he wasn't going to be the one to do this. So that's when it comes down to Jackie Robinson. Now, these, breaking the color line in the military, and then, baseball. But when we look at where this starts to need to happen, it's like, you can pass laws, but you can't change minds. The Daughters of the Confederacy knew this. This is why they tried to control education so they can put up this certain type of narrative, although being a false narrative, but still to create this narrative that would later, be in the mindsets of children, and they'll grow up with it, and so forth and so forth. So the real place to really start change to opening minds was in education. Now, when we look at Plessy versus Ferguson, we're talking separate but equal, but in a sense, this wasn't happening. Yes, there was a school for Negroes, and yes, it was a school for white kids, but they were not the same. And you can look at the image there. Very, very different. Overcrowded, grades lumped together, not enough textbooks, not enough material. Basically creating an atmosphere in which eventually you're just going to drop out. It's just not a happy place. So when we look at segregation laws, under the 14th Amendment, you're supposed to have equal protection of the laws. But in a sense, though, like because Plessy versus Ferguson, yes, they are getting schools, yes, they're getting this, but not at the same level. And so we look at school segregation. You can look at a map here. The red being the one of the most where you see most of the segregated schools in the Southwest. I mean, all the way into Texas. Then it starts to whittle down some more. Now, I know for a fact my dad went to school when it was segregated. So, we're not too far from it. So, then comes the lawsuit, the famous lawsuit of Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall would later be Justice of the Supreme Court, argued for the NAACP. And the argument was interesting. It wasn't the fact that they were separate schools, and they weren't even for the most part, they weren't even arguing that like the buildings were better or whatever. They were arguing a defense, and this is one of the first times that you had sociologists brought on the stand that just basically said that it is psychologically damaging to children to tell them they have to go to a different place because of the color of their skin. That even if, like, let's pretend that building and the other building were the same, the fact that you can't go where everybody else goes is psychologically damaging to a child. One of the interesting tests around this time is called the doll test. And you can see an image there. And what would end up doing, and what's really sad is when you see like almost toddlers doing the same type of test, is they would put a white doll and then they would put a black doll. And then they would tell them, which one's smart, which one's pretty, which one's bad. And every time which one's bad, it was always the black doll. But this just shows how ingrained into our society, into our psyche, racism is. Like it's in our language. Bad things are always black, good things are always white. And so this was showing why segregation was psychologically damaging to children. And this is just one of the many things they showed before the court. Now, so the court agreed, and this is the beginning of desegregating schools. Now, I mean, this doesn't happen right away. This is something, okay, they ruled, but what's going to happen? It doesn't happen tomorrow. And so, within the sentences, I mean, in the ruling, it's all with all deliberate speed. But what does that really mean? So people in the South came up with all kinds of ways of preventing segregation. I mean, a desegregation, excuse me. And you had instances like, in Virginia, all the schools were closed. Fine. You want us to desegregate them? No, we're just going to close the schools. And so, that was one way of protesting it. They were like, no, our kids aren't going to go there. No. And then another thing that starts to emerge, and this has been more in the news, within the past, couple of years, is these symbols of the Confederacy. Now, what we have to understand is all these statues and names and streets and schools and all kinds of stuff, most of these were not put up after the Civil War. In fact, none of these were made in a sense to honor the Civil War or to honor these people. What they were created to do is instill, one, fear, and two, promote white supremacy, to tell you who's really in charge. And this is when you see all this symbolism of the Confederacy and these statues going up. The most funniest part to me is, the symbol you see on the screen right now, which is the stars and bars, the Confederate flag, supposedly. But that flag never flew during the Confederacy. In fact, the Confederacy never agreed on a flag. The closest that symbol comes, and it was a corner piece, not the whole flag, was the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army. That they had that in the corner of their flag, it wasn't the whole flag. So in no time did they ever use this thing, but now this is what everyone thinks is the flag of the Confederacy. But the reason all these symbols are brought forth, especially in the South, as people are trying to, as African Americans are fighting for their civil rights, they're being reminded who's really in charge by placing these statues all over the place, by people waving the Confederate flag, and by naming schools this and all this stuff in reverence to the Confederacy is not really in reverence to the Confederacy. It is a reminder to African Americans of who's really in charge. So, as the Supreme Court overturns these kind of things, we start to see challenges, because just because they overturn it doesn't mean, like I said, it happens the next day, right? So now African Americans are forced to challenge these things, and forced to make change, and and force this upon others. And one of the most famous incidences of this is, of course, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, there's a rule in Montgomery, Alabama. If you're going to ride the bus, you got to ride. If you're African American, you got to sit in the back, or or give up your seat to a white person if you're sitting in the front. And she refused to do it, saying, this is a violation of my 14th Amendment. And incidentally, anytime you hear of a civil rights case, it's almost always a 14th Amendment case, because it's all about equal protections under the law. And then also this, what comes out of this is they have to create a boycott of the bus system. And this is a really good strategy that a lot of civil rights, activists have used, because who's riding most of the buses? African Americans. So if they start riding the buses, then the bus company hurts for money. And this was very difficult for a lot of them to do, because most of them didn't own cars. That's why they had to ride the bus. But they worked together and they did many different things. Some had to get up super early and walk to work. They created carpooling. And, they came up with all of these different methods to not have to ride the bus, to force the bus to finally desegregate the bus, which eventually they did do. Next, under President Eisenhower, we see him pass the Civil Rights Act of '57. It's kind of, we don't talk too much about it. It doesn't do too much, but it creates this idea. But it does create this idea and this law that we can prosecute you for violating somebody's civil rights. And in this is a law that we was used you know, in different cases when they knew for a fact no jury would convict a white person of murdering a black person. So now, because that was were local laws, and of course they had to be tried and convicted by local juries and local courts. But to bring it to the federal court allowed the federal government to have more of a balanced jury. So you may have murdered someone and gotten away with it, but now we can get you for a violation of somebody's civil rights. Now, when we look at resistance in the schools, there's the infamous, Little Rock Nine, African American students. And I feel so bad for them. They're the first ones to go and desegregate, the high school at Little Rock. And you got to imagine what it's like for these kids. Because these kids, they're going to the high school. And yes, they're allowed in. Of course, they have to call troops in and all kinds of stuff to allow them to come in. But really, you know, they're going somewhere where they're going to be hated and mistreated and called names, all. And so those first nine, they were pretty much, they were pretty much the ones that had to take all that to open the door for more. So these are brave children. They took the brunt of it. Like, they were not going to happy place. They weren't. Their last years in high school were not going to be good or happy, but it was something that needed to be done, and they did it. And there were many governors who stood up, opposed. You had Orville Furbus, George Wallace, all these guys putting themselves in front of the buildings, symbolically to not allow desegregation. George Wallace makes that famous speech: segregation now, segregation forever. And so as a result of slowly breaking these barriers, we have what we call white flight, the formation of private schooling, people moving away from the cities, creating communities, all white communities, so that they could keep their children away from African Americans. So in a sense, this is what we have. Segregation still exists, just simply because of geography. Um, Also, you had a series in 60 and 61 known as the Freedom Rides, which are college students that were trained in the North and then were to go down south and help work with people, African Americans, trying to register to vote, to try to break up segregated like restaurants. I can see the famous picture there in North Carolina where they're being, they poured coffee on them, they pour food on them, drag them out of the business. And a lot in the here's a map of the route, of different places. You can see arrested, jailed, arrested, and and then the infamous ones in Mississippi that were murdered. And these, their buses were attacked and on fire, as you can see here in this image. And some people in the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King, was criticized for almost sacrificing these young people for their movement. And so you have all these famous images, and it became almost like a rite of passage for these kids to get arrested. They went in such numbers because they figured they'd break the county budget, overfilling their jails and county jails. And one of the ones who goes down and get arrested is Martin Luther King himself. And there he is in jail, and he's looking for to quantify his thoughts of what is going on. And he starts to think, of different people who've done different actions, nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, and he looks to people like Gandhi. But Gandhi and King look to a man named Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau literally wrote Civil Disobedience, and Henry David Thoreau wrote this because he was jailed as well. And the reason he was jailed is he was against slavery and against the Mexican American War, the invasion of America into Mexico. We thought it was illegal. Most people did. I mean, well, in Congress, the president was even censured after that. But point being is he was jailed for not paying his taxes because he said, my money will not go to support an illegal war. So he stopped paying taxes, he gets arrested. Eventually, people raise money and pay his taxes for him, and he gets out. But he writes this thing about like how, we have the duty to, fight back, and we can do this in ingenious ways. That wasn't a violent protest, but literally, if everyone stopped paying their taxes, the government would go to a standstill. So, it was an interesting method. And he writes about this type of civil disobedience. If jail is the only place for just men, then all just men should be in jail. There's that famous story that someone came and asked him, "What are you doing in jail? What are you doing in there?" And he replies back, "Well, what are you doing out there? Because you're out there supporting an evil system." Now, one of the biggest marches is of course the March on Washington in '63, and this was a march for awareness and a march to push forth, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. This is where Martin Luther King delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech of a world where color wouldn't be something that would drag you down. And so this was to raise awareness and show Congress that we need to get this done. And so the Civil Rights Act is passed and eliminates discrimination in anything funded by the government, which in a sense then spreads to other things. And so this, if you want any kind of contract with the government, even if you're selling on paper, you cannot have discriminatory practices. So this is, another help up for African Americans and minorities in general to start to get better treatment, being allowed to work in certain places weren't allowed to work in before. Then, of course, the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was, if you can complain and march, but if you don't have the vote, who's going to listen to you? So the Voting Rights Act was to give them the voice in government they needed in order to force change, in order for Congress, people, congressmen, senators, whatever, to listen to them, because if now they have to court their votes. So the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, are crucial to the movement towards equality. Sadly, a lot of the tenets of the Voting Rights Act have been allowed to expire, so we're starting to see different things like ID laws and other things to try to, put barriers from people from voting. Now, when we look at the struggle for equal rights, it's not just African Americans, and it's women as well. One thing that comes out in this civil rights movement is a law called Title IX. Title IX says that in schools you can't discriminate against gender, and this is why girls are now allowed to play sports and have sports teams, and allowed to be in different. And then this isn't just sports though. This goes into any club in the school, and this is expanded access to different clubs and athletic organizations for women. Um, and of course, we spoke of African Americans, and then we'll I'll discuss a little bit Mexican Americans and Native Americans. So when we're looking at African Americans, there were, many people, very articulate people out there talking and promoting and explaining the, what, they go through on a daily basis, explaining the roots of racism, explaining these things to America, not just to themselves, but to America. We can look at Langston Hughes. Well, when he talk in Harlem, and he talks about like what happens to a dream deferred. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or a crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? And he's talking about the dreams of a generation of people. What happens to them? Like everyone has a dream for themselves. Everyone has a dream for their children. And what happens when it doesn't happen? What happens to them? What happens to all generations of them? Um, Gil Scott Heron wrote this. It's almost like a rap, or it's not really a song per se. I'm going to attach the video here to the video lecture, with the list of videos I want you to play and listen, watch, and you'll hear the whole thing. But you may or not have heard it. But basically, you will not. The revolution will not be televised. Like you will not be able to stay at home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn out, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag, which is heroin, and skip out for beer commercials. He's saying the revolution is active. The revolution isn't going to happen till you get out there. You want your rights. You need to get out there and fight for your rights, not just stay home and wait for it to happen. And you can hear the whole thing on the video I'll attach to this lecture. And then you have, different polarizing identities during, the African American Civil Rights Movement. You have, of course, Martin Luther King, who is all about nonviolent, protests, nonviolence, and civil disobedience. And one thing I will point out about Martin Luther King is right now, he's revered in the United States by all people, but at the time, even he was labeled a terrorist. Even his like non-violent acts were labeled as terrorists, as terrorism. He was, we a lot of times will go like, oh, look at Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and and MLK. He was grouped with all of them. You know, he was a very controversial figure back in the day. And even he, as they were, as they were facing all kinds of injunctions and blockages, and they faced all these things. Even he said that, if you continue this, all we will have left is violence. So he even acknowledged that violence would come. And so when you look at people like Malcolm X, we'll talk about Malcolm X and we'll talk about the Black Panthers. Malcolm X embraced the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. And in what he preached was, a form of segregation, that white people were evil, they were devils, and they, they're the and there was, a lot of people were attracted to this cause because they were outspoken. They talked about, defending themselves. You put your hands on me, I'm going to put my hands on you. They talked about not sitting there and taking it. They talked about, the evils of trying to work with white people. And even though some of this, may have been skewed, there was a lot of young people who had just had enough. But what's really interesting about Malcolm X is he starts off as a staunch follower of Elijah Muhammad. But then he goes. I'm not sure that much about Islam, but every Muslim must make at least one pilgrimage to Mecca. That's something you have to do. There's ways around it, like if you can't afford it, but in a sense, all good Muslims do this. So Malcolm X goes to Mecca, and there, when he's there, his mind gets opened. He says that he sees Muslims of all colors, of all kind, caste of society, just living, eating, praying, together. And he started to like break down this idea about just like, separatism of African Americans. And then at that point, he starts to talk about, allowing white people into the movement. And, if they want to help, let them help. And he eventually breaks with Elijah Muhammad, and because he's told on several occasions, that he's becoming too popular, and eventually, it's still a mystery today. Most people tell you that Elijah Muhammad had him assassinated, but that's still a mystery today. There's a really good documentary about that on Netflix if you want to check it out. And Malcolm X was just one of many figures in the African civil rights movement. There was James Meredith who talked about creating this march against fear in '66, and what it was is like we are not scared of you. There's all this violence, burning crosses, and lynching. We're not scared, of you, and we're not afraid to march for our rights. And sadly, he's wounded by a sniper, and there's a picture of him laying down, so you can see how well that went over. But the protests continued. People like Stokely Carmichael talking about Black Power, and and Black Power movements were about self identity, that there's nothing wrong with being black, and there's nothing wrong with our skin or our hair. And just this thing of self, that we're beautiful, black is beautiful, is another thing that come around the time, because too long in America, black was ugly, black was bad. Anything to do, anything that wasn't white was bad. So this is that psychological damage that they're talking about in Brown versus Board. And so they're trying to break free of this. Another group that emerges in African American civil rights movement is the Black Panther Party, and there you see them holding guns, and kind of like they're known for violence. Is usually if you talk Black Panthers, that's usually the first image you get popped in your head. But they follow the whole credo that You put your hands on me, I'm gonna put my hands on you. Self-protection. But really, what most of the job of the Black Panthers, to be honest, wasn't being out there, fighting people or whatever. They created after school programs, lunch programs in the summer, tutoring, job training, anything to help their people in their neighborhood. That's really what the bulk of their work actually was about. And but at the same time, we have to talk about the violence. Actually an argument in American history. People talk about, like, how much of a role did Martin Luther King play, and how much of a role did violence play? Because at the time he's marching and stuff, there are cities that are blowing up in violence. And so some people think that maybe the violence scared people more than Martin Luther King, and that's kind of what drove these laws to be passed. One of the biggest year of violence was in '68, especially after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Cities erupted in flames. And when you can look at riots in different ways, but a lot of riots are usually start off as a response to the police killing somebody, and nothing much has changed. But a lot of people look at riots, as being inherently evil things, and why are they doing that? Why do they act that way, and so forth. But I posit you this: these people, like, someone's murdered, normally you would get an investigation, someone would get arrested, and go to jail. But this didn't happen when African Americans are murdered, especially by cops. Nothing would happen. Like, who were they to turn to? The police? The police ain't gonna listen to them. The DA not gonna listen to them. There was no law they could listen to, and this just so this frustration blows up in violence. And I'm not justifying riots, but I'm just trying, showing the logic behind why do people act that way. Finally, you have well, not finally. I'll talk about the Native American movement in a second, but we'll talk about the movement, the Chicano movement. Um, Chicanos, the word Chicano, I mean, for older people right now, it's almost like a bad word, because Chicanos are the ones who stood up and were causing trouble and so forth. But anyway, when we look at the movement for the rights of Mexican Americans, there's a couple of things that we can look at. Like, earlier I talked about Brown versus Board of Education, but Brown versus Board of Education and all these practices desegregation, and allowing African Americans into places and stuff, honestly wasn't really applied to Mexicans. And the reason is this: it goes all the way to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that made us citizens. The problem was the United States Constitution only recognizes three categories: whites, African Americans, and Native Americans. And so they had no real category for Mexican Americans. So that's why to this day you fill out a form and you put Anglo. But what this did was, it almost, if you look, stepping back, you'd think, oh, they're labeled as Anglos. That's good. You don't get discriminated upon. But of course they did. But what would happen time and time again is, if you actually complained, like, they didn't let me in this restaurant, or they didn't let me do this or that, you go before a court, and they would go like, "You're white. We don't discriminate against whites." Case thrown out of court. So it was used against us until the case of Hernandez v. Texas, in which those lawyers argued something that they called a class apart. That if you're going to label us as whites, we're a distinct class apart from whites, and in that sense, we are being discriminated, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. And so this argument can actually be used by many different groups who may be considered white but are discriminated against. And so this ruling was a big thing for Mexican Americans and Latinos, but it becomes a big ruling for other marginalized groups that are labeled white yet they're being segregated. Now, but really, the ones we look at when we talk about, like, the movement toward equal rights and stuff, it starts with the farm worker movement. And the reason they have to have this big farm worker movement is because every labor law that had been passed, even the New Deal legislation, was never always exempted agriculture. So they weren't, they didn't have union protections. They didn't have any of this. They had no protections, in fact. So people like Cesar Chavez you see there, and then of course Dolores Huerta, get started together and they formed the United Farm Workers Union to push for better pay, better conditions, and better treatment of farm workers. Now, they tried strikes, they tried different type of protests, but the most effective one that came down to was basically a boycott. Stop people from buying certain goods until those companies treat their workers better. And the most famous and infamous one is the boycott on grapes. They stopped. What they would do is they wouldn't protest there in the fields and stuff. What they did is they went to grocery chains all over the country and stood out there with pamphlets explaining how they were being treated and to please don't buy grapes. And this, hit them financially in the millions. Eventually, you have to come down and um, and negotiate with them and get better pay and better working conditions. And so, United Farm Workers Union, converts in time over to Lupe, which I think the Lupe buildings in San Juan here, the local one. But what it does is like at the beginning, this was like all about farm workers, but now they wanted more engaged in the community in general, and that's what becomes Lupe today. Now, another figure that looms large in the civil rights era is Dr. Hector P. Garcia. Dr. Garcia was heavily involved in what was known as the Longoria Affair. He had formed something called the American GI Forum, which was a civil rights organization for former GIs who were pushing for civil rights, not just for themselves. They were heavily involved in trying to get better education, better schools. But what really launched him into the national landscape was something known as the Longoria Affair. Felix Longoria was killed in battle in the Philippines, and he was sent home to Three Rivers to get buried. The local funeral home owner, um, embalmed her and stuff, but he told his widow that she couldn't, have a service there in the funeral home because Mexicans were never allowed services like that, and of course they had desegregated burial, and she was very upset. He was a war hero, and here he is, being denied service in a funeral home, to be, laid in wake, and she was furious, brokenhearted, called a bunch of people. Eventually, uh, Hector P. Garcia gets a hold of it, makes it a national cause. It gets then Senator Johnson involved, and eventually they couldn't force Three Rivers to bury him there. But what Johnson offered was, it was a good thing and a bad thing. He offered to get him buried at Arlington National Cemetery in full military honors, which is a big honor. But for the family, he's not close by. It would be very difficult to, visit the grave, sadly. Of course, he is buried, and but this becomes a national issue, and it highlights the fact of that civil rights actions and discrimination weren't just African Americans. It highlighted what was going on in the Southwest. Another big movement in Mexican American is the mural movement. Now, I teach Mexican American history as well, and that was a big fight in itself. Because our history really is part of the United States, but it's not mentioned anywhere, most U.S. history textbooks. And so, a lot of our history is passed on to ourselves, like, in story or corrido or so forth. Another way our history is demonstrated to ourselves and to each other is through murals. The mural movement, these huge murals that you see a lot more in California than you see here, but they're really telling stories of our heroes or our past, or discrimination we faced, or the horror of conquest and colonization. All, our history was displayed visually for a long time before it made its way into history books. Now, forgive me, I just noticed something, and I'm not going to redo this. I forgot my slide on Native Americans. In all this time that people are putting forth, pushing for civil rights, you also have the Native American movement, the Red Movement, and they were, trying to also, you know, promote the fact that, they had been illegally removed from their land. They had treaties and titles to land that they were kicked out of illegally. And they, in many instances, they tried to protest to take back some of the land. One very famous protest was the one in Alcatraz Island, the famous prison, because it used to be part of a tribe's territory. And they actually occupied it for a while after it was closed down. You have the Second Battle of Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee was the site of a major massacre of Native Americans, and so they reoccupied that land, and they wouldn't budge. And then eventually, the FBI shows up. There's a shootout. There's more killing on the same place that a massacre had happened years before. And with the, we had different people stand up and try to first get people to acknowledge first that they still existed. Many people just thought Native Americans had died away or disappeared, and in a sense, just were, written off. That was back then. They're gone. So part of it was just getting awareness and recognition that they exist, and then also the fact that their land was stolen from them, was taken from them, that they were forced to into native boarding schools in which they were removed and ripped from their parents' arms and gone, and taken away to a school where they forgot their language. They, made them, basically kill their culture, and made them Christianize themselves, make them get Christian names, cut their hair, dress and look like Anglos, and in a way, this is under the definition of genocide. That is the very definition of genocide is it's not just killing people, it's killing culture, it's killing language as well. So to highlight these to the American people, what was going on, their issues, them being the oldest Americans, and they're still fighting to this day. And I just read an article recently about another tribe that their status was removed from them, like as far as federal recognition. And so these fights and these wars are still happening. And in a sense, the civil rights movement is still happening. We haven't seen true equality yet. It's something that this nation's going to have to deal with for a long, long time. Now, I hope you guys watch the videos that are linked to these, and I look forward to doing the next one. But in a sense, this is just kind of a little odd for me because this isn't how I envision myself teaching. But here we are. I thank you for listening, and I hope that you're doing well and being safe out there. And have a good day.